have the pleasure today of being able to introduce our second session speaker. This is a gentleman who I hold dear to my heart. We have done a lot of interesting things together here in Richmond, and I'm honored to be a board member of Indiana Landmarks, who Marsh Davis is president of. Marsh is a very accomplished person in historic preservation fields, reinvestment. He's an accomplished photographer, a published author, and a perfect house guest as well. We sat up last night and watched Johnny Carson reruns. I'll just go ahead and introduce to you Marsh Davis. Indiana Landmarks is the nation's largest nonprofit statewide historic preservation organization. They have an endowment that is very large. Their reach throughout the state is extensive. Probably one of the most significant projects that they've dealt with was the redevelopment of the West Baden Springs Hotel in West Baden, Indiana. Terrific organization. I've been involved with it for decades, and we're very lucky to have this sort of group serving our state and all the communities here. So I'll welcome Marsh Davis.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Matt, for that very kind introduction. This is number 5 of these conferences, right? You know, it takes a lot of people to pull this together, and Matt will acknowledge those, I think, over the lunch time. But really takes a visionary leader, and Matt, thank you for this has become a great annual event, and the attendance here and the diversity of attendees is remarkable. So my compliments to you. And you should know that at the state level, you have no greater champion for Richmond than Matt Stegall. He is a bulldog who keeps us. We're all in for Richmond anyway, but with Matt, it's a requirement. We will be with you all the way as long as we exist, because this community is very richly endowed with historic resources. And I would like to acknowledge my colleagues from Indiana Landmarks who are here. J.P. Hall, who runs the Eastern Regional Office of Indiana Landmarks in Cambridge City, and you met earlier Mike Flowers, who in addition to his duties in Eastern Indiana through the regional office, also is the executive director of the Indiana National Road Association, which extends across the state of Indiana. So we're very happy to be part of this venture here in Richmond, and number 5 at this conference. Thank you, Matt, for all you're doing to make this happen. Well, when Matt asked me to talk about this, I was really concerned, because I know there are people in this audience. The topic, if you haven't seen the program, is to talk about some of the benefits of historic districts of all natures. And I look out here and I see people who are experts in this, who deal with this day in, day out, and who could easily give a preservation conference on the benefits and the meaning of historic districts. But I also discern from Matt that this was more of a general crowd. So instead of me giving a presentation about what is a historic district and what they do, because that will maybe be useful to half of you and then put to sleep the other half, I thought we might use this more as a conversation about what these historic districts mean, and bring it down to a more personal level. I was in Houston, Texas, Tuesday for a day-long session with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And they're doing these meetings around the country to gauge the future of historic preservation, like where are we heading with the movement. And one of the things that became apparent in these discussions is there is a palpable disconnect between the language and the viewpoints and the understanding that is carried by historic preservation professionals, or people who deal with it on a regular basis, and the people and the laymen, if you will, people who often live in historic districts but don't think about historic preservation every day. And the concern is that we find ways to bridge that gap in the way we communicate and the way we reach people. And things are changing rapidly, especially we looked back. We're in a big period of reflection right now in historic preservation. This is the 50th anniversary of the passage of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. So one of the questions we had, what's different between 1966 and 2016? And one of the clear things, I mean, there's so many obvious ones, but I think probably the most profound is the advancement in communication technology, if that's even the right term for it. I don't know, but things are changing so fast. The way we reach one another, and the fact that we are increasingly self-obsessed. We look at what people put on Facebook. You know, the kitty rolls over and plays with a ball of yarn, and suddenly it's interesting to people around the world. Or what we have for dinner, for some reason, is of interest. So the point of all it is that the way people are perceiving their world, it's becoming increasingly individualistic and individually personal. And so what does that have to do with preservation? Well, we're trying to figure out what these old places mean to people, and how do we reach them, and how do we convey the values of what it is that we're advocating for. And this may sound slightly highfalutin when you think, well, you've got miles and miles of decaying housing, and here we're talking on a philosophical level. But I really think it's important that we do, especially us preservation professionals, find increasingly meaningful ways to communicate with people in the community, whether it's in local government or just the property owners, the people we're trying to reach. Basically, we're the advocates for preservation and for trying to state the case for, in the narrow context of this discussion, historic districts. And implicit in all that is the suggestion that the motivation for why we create historic districts may be changing. So this will be a discussion about historic districts, the types of historic districts we are, about public and personal perceptions of these districts. Why do we create them in the first place? What are the benefits that these districts bring to both the community and to the individual property owners? And some realities and myths about historic districts. And again, there are so many experts out here in the room that I hope that those who are the preservation professionals will chime in when appropriate, and then those who are looking at this from a more general sense and are more curious about it will also ask pointed questions. Maybe we can have a little debate about some of these points. I want this to be more of a discussion when we get into this. So first, I mean, how many people here are from Richmond? And so a good chunk of you. This seems to be increasingly a regional conference, which is good. So I guess the opposite. How many people are from outside of Richmond? And how many are not from Indiana? So we've got a few. Great. That bodes well for the future of this conference. How many of you live in historic districts? Let's narrow that a bit. How many are in National Register districts and local historic districts? How many don't know the difference? So there are maybe a few people. I mean, honestly, are you all? Let me ask it then, just honestly. How many of you are really quite familiar with local historic districts as opposed to National Register historic districts? So there's a little different result in that. Ask the same question a different way. So that's good, because that will, again, I think, inform how we move this forward. How many of you serve on local historic preservation commission boards? So you're the real heroes. What a thankless task. God bless you for doing that. I mean, I don't know what motivates you, but how many of you had to appear before a historic preservation commission for permission? Was it fun? Has anyone been denied a certificate of appropriateness from a preservation? Good. How many of you think that local preservation districts diminish individual property rights? Seriously, nobody? Good.
My community does, but
Yeah, well, And do any of you believe that local designation diminishes property value? Good. Well, this maybe a little too easy. Let's talk first about, since there was, I got the sense that not everybody here, in fact, more than not everybody, but that there's a substantial group here that is not entirely comfortable with the difference between a local historic district and a National Register historic district. One of the best descriptions of the difference was a country lawyer here in Indiana, and this is kind of a Hoosier thing, but he said, local districts and national districts are like morels and mayapples. I should have done this about 6 weeks ago when the morels were up, and maybe if you don't know what a morel is, you're probably not from Indiana, but he said they're like morels and mayapples. They grow in the same places, but they're entirely different things. I thought, that is really a nice, I've never forgotten that, and that was probably 20 years ago. But that being the case, there's a great deal of public confusion about what these districts actually mean. There's a lack of understanding. That lack of understanding leads to mistrust, and that mistrust leads to opposition to getting districts established. I think those of us who have been working in the field can name many examples where that mistrust has led to opposition, has actually prevented areas from being listed in the either in the National Register and certainly in being locally designated. I'll give you, and then it's really exacerbated today by, again, the change in the social media, because everybody now has an expert. Everybody has a soapbox through the internet, through blogs. Just last week, one of our big projects at Indiana Landmarks is the restoration of the Greyhound bus depot in Evansville, and we've got a contract, a lease lined up with one of the great restaurateurs in Indianapolis to open a Brewburger bar in this depot. Well, we're now in the process of designing the contract to do the interior of this station, and it's a little complicated, and we're a little behind schedule on that because we've gotten some other bids. It's going to cost a lot less to do. But a local blogger, news comes out in Evansville. For some reason, it's a big deal that the Brewburger is going to be a little later in arriving than we thought. But so this blogger says, well, the delay in the Brewburger is no doubt due to the inflexibility of Indiana Landmarks, and puts that out there. Like, it doesn't call, doesn't even seek to get good information. So in this ever quickening world of information, dealing with that mistrust and that opposition is increasingly challenging. So let's just talk for a minute about the distinctions between the national districts and the local. So for general purposes, we'll say a national district is one which is listed in the National Register of Historic Places. Now, there are those from Madison know that there's the National Historic Landmark designation, which is very rare and wonderful, but for purposes today, we'll talk about National Register of Historic Places. The National Register in its current form came out of the National Preservation Act of Congress in 1966, as I mentioned earlier, and it established a program, the National Register, which is primarily honorific, that acknowledges the significance of a property at local, state, or national level. And for the most part, these have been based, the designations have been based, not entirely, but mostly on historical or architectural significance. So in a historic district, the typical place we find has a cohesive character about it. That cohesiveness can be found in the design and scale of the buildings, the era during which the buildings were built. There could be a cultural identification. One of the first nominations that I wrote years ago was in Detroit. It was for the Hamtramck Historic District. It was a Polish community. And you could count on one hand the houses that you might think of as being architecturally significant, but there were, I think, 700 houses that fit into this broader cultural cohesiveness. And that was the basis of that nomination, not architecture. Another thing that we look at a lot is integrity, and that is how much does a property reflect its historic character, and historic meaning the period of significance that we define for a historic district. An example might be a bungalow district, which would have been the period of significance might be between 1910 and 1935, and so we look for characteristics, physical characteristics that match that era. All this you should know at the high levels at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the National Park Service, are being examined quite closely now, and could be changing to create a more diversified, more democratic, more individualistic approach to these designations, breaking away from the rigid classifications and this obsession with integrity that we often have. But there's often the perception, even with the National Register districts, that they restrict property use and they restrict change. Does it? Can anyone answer that? Does the National Register listing of a district or an individual property restrict private property activities? No. Everybody clear on that, because that's one of the big myths. Now, sometimes what they don't know doesn't hurt us, because people think they can't do something and they don't do it. But by and large, the National Register, if your property is listed in a National Register district, you as a private property owner, unless you have some kind of a connection to federal funding, you can do what you want. It is not a protective measure, unless there are federal funds being used. And the protective measure, and this is where it gets confusing to the layman, there is a protective measure with the National Register of Historic Places, which is fundamental to its purpose, and that is to create a review process in the event that publicly funded projects would have an impact on that landmark or that district. The best example I can give you is those of you who've been to the Indiana Landmark Center, which is our headquarters in Indianapolis. Behind that is the Morris Butler House, which was our first project. Interstate 65 cuts around on the north side of the downtown, and fortunately, the Morris Butler House had been listed in the National Register of Historic Places prior to the construction of the highway. And there's an actual deviation of that highway. Had it gone its natural route, natural being from the federal highway perspective, it would have cut right. It would have gone right through the Morris Butler House and the old Methodist Church, where our headquarters. That all would have been under the highway right now. So that's the protective measure that the National Register can provide in the use of them when federal funds are used. I think this is probably, I gather, fundamental to most of you, but it's not. It's not to broader members of the community, and it's something that I know my colleagues and I at Indiana Landmarks have to articulate probably every day, that the National Register is not an impediment to private property rights and how you use your property, or what color you can paint it, or if you want to tear it down or not. It's just a myth, and sometimes we can provide brochures about it, and people say, "Oh, I still don't believe it," and they'll oppose it. We had I'll save that for later. So again, the perception is often a lot different between those of us who are familiar with preservation and those who are not. Now, what are the advantages then? Well, there are tangible and intangible benefits of being listed in the National Register of Historic Places. I should ask, maybe turn it out to you. What are some of the benefits of being listed in the National Register of Historic Places? Anybody got an experience that could speak to that? Tax credits? Tax credits for rehab, and how does that work? Income producing, all right.
So they're good for main streets.
Right. The National Register listing is the first step in being eligible for the use of the rehabilitation tax credits, which, and we're talking about the federal tax credits now, because Indiana, unlike our friends in Ohio, we don't have a state commercial rehab credit anymore. But being listed in the National Register is the first step toward being eligible for the rehab tax credits, which has been a driving force for the last, really since 1981, in the redevelopment, particularly of cities and towns, using the commercial rehab credits for what's now a 20% credit, federal income tax credit. But there's also a much lesser used and known state tax credit for residential rehab, since a lot of the districts that we worry about are residential. So having that National Register designation as part of a district can be extremely helpful if you're pursuing the state residential rehab tax credit. We almost lost it this past year in the legislature, but you should know that Indiana Landmarks has fought for that year after year, and we still have it. It's very precarious, but if you're interested, I'd say use it now because it may not be around forever. What other advantages are there to National Register listing? Tom?
Well, just quality design.
Quality design, but there's nobody tells you what you can do.
Quality design and time period.
Yeah,
Like our high school here, it's I was one of the best WBA projects.
so
My
it
grandfather,
recognizes quality design. Yeah,
the superintendent at that time, was a good superintendent, didn't want it to be a historic site because he thought it might jeopardize.
did not want it to become a National Register listed. Yeah, that happens a lot. So the benefit to some becomes an impediment to what people want to do, even though it's not true, right? Matt.
How about CLG?
CLG, Certified Local Government. And what's the advantage there?
A community has a historic preservation commission qualified to become a certified local government under the federal government program, which would put preference for that community to get funding for projects that are situations as far as how to live and live.
Prioritize funding, in a word, is one of the values of certified local government, as well as streamlining the process for getting things designated and so forth. Yeah. I think some of you have worked, Scott, you've been part of a CLG program here. Yeah. Matt, another benefit of National Register listing.
Various state grant assistance and technical assistance to the DNR.
It makes National Register districts and listing, yes, it makes certain projects, it helps in the scoring of projects for state and local grants.
As well as the actual availability of funds for not-for-profits in ownership or rental capacity of those buildings.
Yes,
Bricks and mortar.
good. Tourism dollars? And how has that worked in your community? So some of these are very, very specific, tangible, technical benefits, and some are more intangibles, like the benefit of tourism, the recognition, or the perception that it brings. What I've experienced in the National Registered neighborhoods where I've lived over time is that it creates an identity for an area. I'll give an example. I used to live in a neighborhood in Indianapolis called Meridian Park. It was part of a huge area called Maple and Fall Creek, which has a pretty constant housing stock throughout a vast area. But we wanted to have a more distinct identity, and having a smaller portion of that vast neighborhood identified as historic Meridian Park created an identity. It created a brand, if you will, but most importantly, it created a sense of community. I remember Suzanne Stannis is here from Indiana Landmarks, and way back when we were working on the North Meridian Street National Register District. North Meridian Street in Indianapolis is about a 4-mile stretch of uninterrupted, mostly early 20th century period style houses, no commercial intrusions, back many years ago we worked to get that listed, but one of the lessons we learned there is that you don't just, we know it's eligible, but do the owners know, and why should they care? So we began a series of backyard parties that I recall, but what came out of that was not only the educational component, but one of the neighbors said to me, and I thought this was one of the best things I've ever heard. He said, before we had this National Register nomination process, before we had this identity and these events, said we were a street of houses. Now we are a neighborhood, and that stuck with me for almost 30 years. So that's one of the intangible benefits of creating a National Register district. It fosters neighborhood. In some cases, it really is the creation of a neighborhood. Meridian Park that I mentioned earlier really was, that was kind of a name that we concocted and created. There wasn't historically a Meridian Park. It appeared on the plats as a development, but there was no Meridian Park neighborhood until the historic folks got together and created it. There's also, while there are no design requirements in the National Register process, there is in a district, though, when you have the sense of community, there's kind of a peer pressure among neighbors that nobody tells you from a legal standpoint what you can or cannot do. But when the general consensus around you is that people care about their properties and want to keep them up, that neighbor peer pressure we have seen is also one of those intangible values that it comes with National Register listing. And of course, the tax credits we mentioned and the National Register 106 review that protects historic properties. Those are some of the benefits. Any other benefits that I need to mention? My colleagues and land, yes.
I think it really encourages corporations to think about your community to move to. I mean, there have to be a lot of things like hospitals, schools, but I think it's a very important.
It encourages people, corporations, and probably individuals too, to attracts them to the community because it's part of that, one of the layers of the quality of life. In addition to, I think you'll find that to be the case almost across the nation. Let's talk about local districts now. These would be, I guess, the Morels versus the Mayapples in our discussion. Because they're a little rarer, not as rare as Morels, but one of the first, probably the first local designation came in 1931 with Charleston, South Carolina. And obviously there was a very rich architectural heritage that people wanted to protect. But I also believe quite firmly that there was a pretty strong economic program at play there. And that was, even back in the 20s and 30s, Charleston was a tourist destination. And they were not dummies. They wanted to protect that. The community wanted to protect one of their best economic assets, and that was the historic properties. So Charleston was the first, followed about 5 years later, I think in 1936, by the Vieux-Carré Commission in New Orleans. Again, major tourism destination. Yeah, the architectural heritage is extraordinary, but it was also an economic component, and there's nothing that we need to be ashamed of in tossing that into the mix. Well, our state legislation our state has legislation that allows for the establishment of ordinances at the county and city level to designate local landmarks, both as individual properties or as districts, and then to regulate change, to manage the change in these properties by way of guidelines that are overseen by an appointed commission. I can go into all the details but that's the general process, the general route which these take. And often, this is the Morel and Mayapple thing, often those local districts follow identical or very similar boundaries to the National Register districts. Not exactly in some cases, but by and large, they're very, very similar. Hence the confusion, I think, often between national and local designation. Again, the purpose, when we talk about local districts, is not to prevent change. We're really talking about managing change. Same with Indiana Landmarks. Indiana Landmarks holds easements on hundreds of properties around the state. An easement is not a document that says thou shalt not. It simply states that if you're going to do something, run it by the holder of the easement and get permission to do it, but also get some guidance. Is this the best thing to do? It doesn't say you can't do it. It says, but if you're going to do something, let's make sure we do it right. And that is really, so when we talk about local districts where there are design guidelines and restrictions, that we talk about not preventing change or trapping a building in amber, but looking at how we manage the change, which is inevitable because our districts are going to change. They cannot be locked in time if they're going to be viable, livable communities. And that all gets into the public perception. So again, let's look at some of the benefits, which are tangible and intangible. Years ago, almost 20 years ago, we commissioned Donovan Ripkema, who has spoken twice at this conference in recent years, which is another testimony to Matt's ability to attract, put together an outstanding conference. It's hard to get Don Ripkema in a decade to come to your community. He's had him twice in 3 years here in Richmond. But back many years ago, in the late 90s, we commissioned Don Ripkema to look at the benefits of local designation from a purely real estate-based perspective. And we studied communities from Elkhart to Evansville, Vincennes, Indianapolis, Anderson. And typical of Don Ripkema, he didn't just look at the economic or the real estate data. He took it toward those intangibles. And he found that in every case, locally designated districts, when compared to adjacent non-designated areas of similar housing stock, similar income levels, the locally designated areas had a greater sense of stability, longer home ownership, interestingly, a greater degree of diversity, higher home ownership, and lower foreclosure. We heard some of that from Cleveland already. These are the benefits that we found by starting with real estate data, and we find that this is true across the state in historic districts of all manner. And some are in distressed areas. These are not all the high-end, wealthy historic districts. But why do we want to manage change in the district? Why would we want to have a local historic district and to have to appear before either a staff or a commission to make a change to our properties? Why do we want to do that? Anybody have what motivates us? Yeah.
Our mansions, they created it to preserve them. You know, you see red nails right in the middle of all these beautiful mansions. There was no district there. There was no
Yeah.
nothing to protect houses. Now, you know, you can't do it. And if it does come down, you can't really put it into place. So that basically conserve our mansions.
So it prevents inappropriate intrusions. It helps prevent demolition, and it helps.
There won't be a Dollar General.
Yeah. You don't want you don't want a Dollar General in Mansion Row, and that happens. Any other reasons why would a community want to do it? Why did Madison do it? Yeah.
Well, you're obviously, it's the history. We have 103 contiguous blocks of history that disappear without it. And some would say, what it does is it maintains the value of the homes.
Maintains the value, both aesthetic and economic, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's a good lead into some of them. I'll go through, and if anybody wants to comment on any of these, just please raise your hand. But these are some facts about local historic district designation. The public identification and targeting of historic areas provides a comfort level for private investment. Let me say that again. So we got a public entity, whether it's the city, that says this area is historic, and we're going to focus on it. The goal there, the intention is that will ultimately attract private investment. Public recognition draws private investment. And I can't think of a better place to state that case than where we're standing or sitting right now, North 10th Street in Richmond. The project that we're working on, that Indiana Landmarks is working on, again, thanks to Matt Stegall. We'll talk a little bit more about it during lunch, but thanks to the Redevelopment Commission, who's committed a substantial amount of money to help Indiana Landmarks take on one of the big problem properties here on North 10th Street. And our goal there, yes, it's to repair this house, but the reason that the city is investing $200,000 in this project is not to help Indiana Landmarks save a pretty old house. It's to encourage private investment, to stimulate more investment and growth. And that is the goal behind this. It's not a one-off thing. So it's a substantial investment from the community, but by their recognizing it, we fully believe, we're putting a lot of stock in it, and this is going to be our project here in Richmond for the next year. We believe that that will incentivize private investment that will ultimately pull up this neighborhood, stabilize property values, and then whatever the city has sacrificed by way of contributing to this project will be more than made up over time through an improved tax base, greater quality of life, and all the residual benefits. So North 10th Street, 231 through 233, when you go out for a break, take a look at it. It's hopefully next year when we're here, Matt, it will be open for tour, or maybe for sale, or maybe be sold. Another fact, creation of a local historic district effectively demonstrates public commitment to an area. So not only does the public recognition incentivize investment, it also demonstrates that it's kind of a seal of approval, if you will, from the elected officials in the community. Property values in historic districts are not frozen. That's another myth that sometimes we encounter, that if your property gets listed either in the National Register or as part of a local district, that your property values will freeze or diminish. Not true. In fact, more often, properties within historic districts, and locally designated historic districts, I should add, appreciate much faster than those in the community as a whole. It's a very important incentive for having local designation. Historic districts can be the catalyst for significant private investment, again, right here on North 10th Street, a good example. Local historic districts can protect and buffer properties from wild market fluctuations. When property values rise and fall, as they have in recent years, look to the historic districts. There's a greater sense of stability. It evens out the peaks and valleys because they are increasingly desirable properties. They retain their value. And again, the idea that historic districts reduce property values is absolutely false. Another myth is that local historic districts and the commissions are unduly burdensome on property owners. So if you're going to make a change, you have to appear before either the staff of a commission or a commission. The statistics around the state point to a process which is vastly tilted toward approval. In fact, I know in Indianapolis it's something like 96% of the applicants are approved on first round. And so really what we see happening is not an impediment to the responsible property owner, but really those few egregious cases are the ones that ultimately do not get approved. So this idea that the preservation police are going to stop everything at every turn is simply not true. Anybody that's been denied disagree with that? Why were you denied?
For something I should have been asking for.
Something you should not have been asking for, and you know that, and you did it anyway. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it just, when we did the Indiana Landmark Center, I hope that some of you have been there. It's an old Methodist church. It's a very complicated project. We had to survey every window. There were about 300 some windows. We had to, every square inch of that building, from the color of the mortar to the light fixtures to the locks on the doors, we ran it through the commission. Our contractors were furious. They hated it. But we know that we got a much better product by doing it the right way. And it slows down the process a little bit and helps you think it through. And I've talked to developers in Indianapolis that say, they're frustrated, but they say, we're glad we had to do this because it made it a better project in the end. So that's anecdotal, but it's again one of the benefits of local designation. Yes.
You had specifically talked about economic benefits alter property values. And I remember Landmarks had done a study or participated in a study years ago about that, where we actually saw the empirical
Yes.
evidence.
That was the Ripkema study that I referenced, that he looked at. I mentioned the intangibles, but I didn't clarify the fact that in every case, the the value of properties in the locally designated areas compared to adjacent similar areas increased at a greater rate. Some cases it was not a dramatic increase, in some cases it was, but in no case did the property values diminish. That's, I think, the first thing. They did not diminish. At worst, they remained consistent with the property values throughout the community as a whole. But in nearly every case, they increased at a rate greater than in those non-designated areas. That was the gist of that whole study, done in 1997. But Ripkema has used that model since across the country, and the data is the same wherever he goes. It's just been one of the consistent things that we found in historic preservation. Yeah.
I was just gonna add on that, what we have found is that while historic districts are not immune to the market crashes and falls, it's been found that they fell less during the housing crash and recovered faster, and that's in both property values and foreclosure rates. And we did a study the other year in San Antonio comparing their local districts, conservation districts, and national register districts. And there was a marked difference between the local districts and the conservation districts, that the more controls they had in place translated into higher property values. The conservation districts did outperform the national register districts, but there was a marked difference between the local districts and the conservation districts.
In the interest of time, I'm not getting into conservation districts, but that's another layer of designation that typically does not get into the detail that a full historic district would. Often regulating just new construction, scale of massing, and but not getting into the details of building. But it's an area to help protect neighborhood character without getting into the details, and it has its pros and cons. But as was stated, I mean, again, it's somewhat counterintuitive, but the more restrictions you have, the greater the stability of the property values, the greater the increase. That is, again, has been the model that Ripkema developed here in 1997 has been replicated across the country, and the data may be different, but the conclusions are the same. And that's a hard thing to sell to the skeptics, believe me, and this is why I guess we're having this discussion. But in all of this, there is still this idea, this not unique to America, but it's pretty intense here, this idea of the individual property rights, that by having a local designation, an ordinance, design guidelines that tells me what I can or cannot do, somehow takes away my property rights. Well, since we're talking about historic districts, you can take that property rights argument and turn it on its head. Why should my neighbor have the right to diminish my property value by doing something inappropriate? A realtor, a friend of mine, said, he said every time, when he has listings, he said every time someone puts up vinyl siding on a house in a neighborhood that's not, where the vinyl siding is not characteristic, every time that happens, the property values go down. And vinyl siding is probably not the most egregious thing that one can do to the property. But if you have this idea that I can do whatever the hell I want with my property, if you do something really bad, that's going to take away your neighbor's property value. So I would say that the property rights value needs to be turned on its head, and that those responsible property owners who are doing the right thing, maintaining their properties, should not allow their property values to be diminished. It's basically a form of theft. Somebody's robbing you of your property values by not maintaining a building properly, or by doing something inappropriate that would diminish the value of the real estate value of the property. Jim?
I was, from Crown Point for many years. I was on a historic review board, and it was a fight all the time because of people that said that you can't tell me what to do with my property. And I'd ask for examples, and most of the things that they were complaining about, the zoning and building department won't do anything. But they come up with ridiculous. If I want to put a nuclear power plant in my backyard, you're not going to.
Yeah.
Or polka dots.
Well,
It all went very ridiculous. It wasn't, there was no real logic.
did you all hear Jim's comment about people complaining about this issue, even though it's more of a theoretical thing? It's like I mentioned that 96% of the applications have been approved by the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission. So it's not like this overly burdensome thing. Yeah.
I have a couple of things. I sit on the historic commission for City of Anderson. And JP and I have had good conversations about this. But just about everything that you have mentioned as a plus for a historic district or locally designated historic district, which Anderson has two, both are federally and locally designated. What is happening in Anderson is the inverse of everything that everyone here is saying. Property owners are abandoning their properties so that these are coming in front of the commission as far as blight elimination. There are over 160 properties within both the West 8th Street district and the historic West Central district that are empty, for sale, for rent, or abandoned.
Is that because of local designation?
We have a commission with that is not qualified per the city ordinance to make any kind of recommendations. What they are doing is saying, well, it looks better now if you do this thing than it did, as opposed to what is appropriate, what is not appropriate for the architectural style of the home. They are more apt to agree to demolish than to support economic development or architectural rehab of these houses.
So in a word, you're saying that your local designation is not helping.
It's worthless.
It's worthless.
And I'm a highly example. I am a preservation professional. I started in fine arts conservation. My husband and I applied it to our two homes. And I am directly across the street from a block that has 7 homes on it, 5 of which are abandoned and empty. Two are rented home, one's a slum multi-unit. The other is occupied by the president of our historic commission, and he has voted for the demolition of all of those properties in the name of property value improvement. What do I do? Where can this
Well,
help?
one of my last points that you beat me to the punch here was that I'll skip over my more comments about individual property rights. I think we've made that point. But all this must be done. It must be done right. And that's another thing that we found through studies both here in Indiana and if your commission is not adequately trained, it can be worthless. In fact, it can be counterproductive to preservation. So there are most communities have standards of people that are appointed to these commissions. If you don't have, I mean, a commission is only as good as the people who populate it. And as for Anderson, I don't know that the overall structure of local designation can address the problems that exist there with significant disinvestment in communities. And if you have a preservation commission which is not adequately populated or appropriately populated, and when you don't have really good guidelines. Several years ago, we worked with the city of Madison. We were so worried because it seemed as though the commission was taking attacks at all ends because they didn't have clear guidelines. And so Indiana Landmarks helped provide some funding through the Ephraimson family to work with the community to create at least, I don't know that they're perfect, but they're a lot clearer than they were before. So if you're working with murky guidelines and you have and the commission is acting inconsistently and or is not rightly populated, it can be a recipe for disaster, and it makes all the local designations across the state suspect to incompetence and it being actually counterproductive.
We're finding that our homeowners are doing things on the weekends, and then the commission won't cite them, and then the city won't back up the citation, and I mean, it really is, this is a bad situation going on in our community. There's no support from City Hall, there's no support at all. You say to somebody outside of the community, I live in the West Central Historic District in Anderson,
Well, the problem you raise is far beyond the historic districts. People often ask me, Indiana, what is the biggest challenge facing your organization? And I would say it is the almost absence of a viable real estate market in huge parts of our state. This has historic districts or not, it's a problem that we face, and that's why when we do projects, I can list 10 projects right now where we're going to lose a significant amount of money because we can't sell. We had anybody know the town of Butler up northeast? Yeah, we had two commercial buildings. We had a local organization that borrowed, I think, we had about $90,000 in this project. It was nice Main Street buildings. Had them on the market, we couldn't sell them. So we had $90,000 in this. We sold them last month. How much? $10. $10. So it's not unique to Anderson, but it's a problem that we have around the state in many communities, more than I care to admit, where there's just not a viable real estate market. And if the real estate has no value, unless you're Indiana Landmarks, who's going to dump $90,000 into a property that's worth $10? So it sounds like we've got a bigger issue in Anderson that we can possibly deal with. And now that I'm 1 minute past 11, but Brent.
I was asked too. As a developer, as someone who's acquired a landmarks property with covenants, as someone who's working in design, the districts haven't been the impediment. The local municipality, another question. But we have had some questions about the double-edged sword that comes with the district. Because you can't remove properties that perhaps should really be demolished. There are times when, as much as you love the building, it's not just an economic question. There's not enough fabric really left. But the federal blight money, once going through a Section 106 review, means that that property either sits for years until it actually gets demolished or is denied demolition. So there is a problem that you can slow development in a district. It doesn't have a huge economic engine driving behind it.
Yeah.
It's on a marginal case anyway, because you can't clean up adjacent properties. They're locked in. Long term, that's to our advantage. The economics will catch up. We're not going to demolish a building that we could save. Short term, it can delay the process of everyone else improving.
Well, you're referring to the funds that have been available from the federal government for demolition throughout our state, and that they're not, and that the National Register districts are off limits. Is that what you're suggesting?
That, and also your municipality's ability to force a property owner to do rehabilitation. In Indianapolis, Health and Hospital issues citations for unsafe buildings. They would go on a demolition list. The city would use that as leverage against the homeowner or the property owner to either clean it up or demolish. Well, if you're in a historic district that's protected, one part of the city government is saying you need to clean that thing up, you need to demolish it, you need to do something about it. And the Historic Preservation Commission is saying you can't demolish it. You have to clean it up. So you lose some of that pressure on the owner, not just with federal money, but in general you lose some pressure. It was at the statewide preservation conference in Vincennes that we had a great lecture by a judge from Texas that talked about how in her court she had methods and means to accelerate this process to get property owners invested by really holding their feet to the fire and literally putting them behind bars short term until you do something about it. Well, if you have the other half of the city, the other half of protection, you lose some of that bite.
Well, Suzanne can comment on that because she's managing our blight elimination process on behalf of Indiana Landmarks, working with the state of Indiana. Do you want to comment?
I just wanted to encourage everyone to take a look at IACET's website, the Indiana Association of Community Economic Development. They also have a panel speaking at the conference and are looking at ways, Indiana's laws that might make some of these things like public confidence not work, or tax lien sales, and things that are really slowing down that process of transferring property. So they have an affinity group on land banking, but they also have regular communications and newsletters put out, and they're a good lobbying organization for these efforts. So
Indiana Association of Community Economic Development.
yeah, IACED. Yeah, take a look at their website and find some helpful information.
And a lot of the information that Colin was bringing to us today too opportunity instead. It's not just convincing the property owner to do it, it's making it economically viable for the property owner.
Well, I can't speak for all the local commissions, but I do know that the work that Suzanne has been doing through our regional offices, reviewing thousands of applications for demolition through the blight elimination program, which does not go through 106. It circumvents that. And that's why we're in the mix. There is no state review of these federal dollars with respect to demolition. But I think we found that for the most part, we have been able to make exceptions when the properties are really egregious. That it's a reasonable process, and that the local, certainly in Indianapolis, we look at projects practically every week that are in historic areas that they're up for demolition. In most cases, it's when it's reasonably understood that the property is beyond the pale, they're not held up. Maybe a couple of days. There's like a minor delay, like 3 days.
Together on a property in Mapleton Fall Creek right now, 30th and Park, where you're an amazing applicant. We're able to stop the demolition of the duplex because we have an economic reason to fix it.
Yeah.
But there's 3 down the street, then we're not gonna have an economic reason to fix it.
Well, you can see this is, I got to wrap this up, but maybe Tiffany, one last comment? Right. Well, and this, which is a reminder, Tiffany runs our Northwest field office in Gary. But that's one of the functions that our regional staff at Indiana Landmarks can serve around the state. I know JP advises Anderson and Muncie and Richmond. And we have, in some cases, where the local communities don't have the ability to hire staff, we serve as almost like a circuit rider for local commissions. But do rely on our resources, our staff resources, information at Indiana Landmarks if you're in this. I think, again, going back to Madison, there was a problem that we thought we could help maybe strengthen their commission by correcting a deficiency, and that was the lack of clear guidelines. And yes, we can do that. I can see that the local commissions and local designation, national, are just part of a bigger picture. And it can't be, all the positive things that I've said about them, I can also say, well, it's not going to solve every problem. It's just one of the tools that we have to work with. And when things are particularly dire, as they are in Anderson, the impact and what positive aspects local designation can bring to bear must be just part of a picture with a lot more incentives. Local designation is not going to solve everything, but when it's done right, and when real estate, unless you're in a free fall in real estate market, local designation has proved itself over time to be a very effective tool. And again, nothing else. If nothing else, it protects the investment of those people when they're functioning right. It protects the investment of those who choose to live or work in those areas, and that's what we hope happens here in Richmond, on right outside the doors of this building. To see that through public recognition, identification of an area, public support for a project to incentivize private development, that we can bring the public and private sectors to work toward improving the quality of life and the economic value of Richmond, Indiana, and communities across our state and nation. There's a lot more I wanted to get into, but time is up. Thank you for engaging this discussion. I think we got a lot of work to do. Thanks.